All right, welcome back. Hopefully, my dog will be quiet enough and the kids won't come home and we can talk our way through. Chapter 15, Section 4. We're going to talk in this section about the Atlantic slave trade, including the Middle Passage. So, our objectives in this section explain how triangular trade worked. What were the three sides of the triangle? What was traded in each? And where geographically did they take place? We'll look a little more closely at the Middle Passage, and this is where slaves were put on ships after being sold in Africa and brought to the Americas. And we'll describe the effects specifically on those people. And we'll look at the impact of the Atlantic slave trade, both on the people and the civilization in Africa, but also on the New World. Our focus question: how did the Atlantic slave trade shape the lives and economies of Africans and Europeans? Now, as we've talked about, first with Portuguese explorers, an international trade network guided by the drive for spices, the drive to make money, the drive to spread Christianity began in the 1500s. Now, as it went forward, a big part of this was trading in human beings. There was a lot of profit to be made, and we'll see, get an idea of just how much profit here in a bit. Africans taken from their homes, from their villages, sold as property and generally sent to the Americas, both North America, Central America, and South America. Now, the Spanish were the first European players, the major players in the slave trade, but certainly they weren't alone. As other European nations established colonies in the New World, specifically the English and the French, the slave trade intensified, and all European nations that had any kind of global trade initiatives were to some extent involved in the slave trade. Now, the book mentions Alada Equiano, who was a prominent slave, probably born in Nigeria, which is right there by the Ivory Coast, captured from his village in that territory and sold as a slave and put on a slave ship and brought to the New World. And the book gives a good quote of his description of his viewing of the slave trip or of the slave ship. Now, there is some controversy as to whether he was actually born in the area of Nigeria or whether he might have possibly been born in South Carolina. Historians don't exactly agree on that, but it's most likely that he was Nigerian. And it's from him that we have a first person account of what it was like to be a slave trade and what it was like to make this Middle Passage. Now, next year, as we move to U.S. history, whether it's in APUSH or American Studies or regular U.S. history, you'll talk more about Equiano. You'll read some of his writings, so use that as a primary document to get that firsthand account of what it was like to experience being a slave and what the slave trade was all about. So, talking about triangular trade, there's a series of routes that link Europe, Africa, and the Americas, again, beginning during the 1500s, uh, utilized by all of the European players. There you see the first leg from Europe to Africa, then from Africa to the Americas, again, both South America, Central and North America, and then the third leg from the Americas back to Europe. So this is what is known as triangular trade, so named because you can see the three sides. The Atlantic slave trade, where slaves were transported to the Americas, was one side, this bottom side of the triangle. So first, European ships brought European manufactured goods to Africa, and this could be guns, could be textiles, could be cash, basically anything that could be manufactured in 1500s, 1600s Europe that might be of value to those that controlled the slave trade in Africa. So that's the first leg. The second leg, slaves purchased, loaded onto ships, and transported to the Americas, is known as the Middle Passage, and this is the one we'll look at more closely. And then the third leg would be carrying goods purchased with the profits from the slave trade. Raw materials mostly from Africa, sugar, cotton, the fur trade certainly in North America was important, but taken back to Europe to be manufactured into textiles, um, other types of clothing. The sugar would go into uh, things like rum and other foodstuffs. You can imagine as commerce happens at each point along this triangle, there's a lot of money to be made. The colonial economies got more wealthy. For example, places where there would be a commercial connection, there would be a shipbuilding industry where money could be made uh, building ships, repairing ships, growing crops that could be transported back to Europe, both tobacco and sugar and cotton and others. There was much profit to be made in this commerce. So those colonies that had port cities, whether those port cities in England like Bristol uh, and Newport, I'm sorry, Bristol in England and in Rhode Island, and certainly other ports, Boston and the like, uh, Charleston in the South, grew very quickly, both in population and also in wealth as a result of this significant trade. So let's look more closely at the bottom leg or the second leg of triangular trade, and that's the Middle Passage. And this is the journey where slaves would make uh, the crossing in cargo ships. And unfortunately, a significant number of the people who were taken from Africa died in that transition. So Africans were taken from their home villages. And again, I want to emphasize, we've talked about this before, it was other Africans, primarily from those coastal nations, who went into the interior, captured, took men, women, and children from their villages, forced them to walk back to the ports in chains, put them in sort of warehouses, awaiting purchase from European traders to be shipped to the New World. An example here from Elmina, Ghana, in one of those sort of coastal warehouses where slaves would be kept ready for purchase. Once slaves were purchased and loaded onto ships, they were literally, quite literally, treated as cargo, and they were packed as tightly as they could possibly be. Most times below deck and set in several different configurations. You'll see an example here of a two levels where, as you can see, there's not much room for each individual person. Generally, they would have a very small space in which to survive this journey. Certainly, they wouldn't be able to stand up. It might just be a couple feet high, and they would have someone right next to them. Obviously, they don't have any kind of facilities that we might think we would or would expect today. So you can imagine the sanitation and the horrid conditions that would exist. Slave ships crossing the Atlantic faced many of the dangers that other expeditions would as well. Certainly, weather was a factor, and sometimes that would be an issue for these slave ships. Conditions were such, whether there were storms or raids by pirates, there might even be mutinies among the slaves. If they had an opportunity to escape their shackles, they might rise up against the crew, and that certainly happened. Oftentimes, these slave ships were described as floating coffins in which half of the Africans on board died. So think about the profit that could be made even if they lost half of their cargo, and the cargo in this case, again, human beings. It was still profitable for them to trade. Most of those that died from issues related to sanitation, dysentery, smallpox. You can imagine in that small proximity how easy it would be to spread disease. Others felt that this very unfamiliar situation which they were in, not knowing what to expect on the other side of this journey, and these horrid conditions, if they had the opportunity, sometimes committed suicide, oftentimes by jumping over the boat or jumping out of the boat or any other means by which they could commit suicide. Now think about the impact of the slave trade on the Africans, both in terms of individuals who were forced to make this journey to the New World as property, as a slave, but also to those villages, those nations, those families that were left behind. African states and societies and villages were torn apart, especially those in the interior of the continent. Individual Africans certainly lost their lives. As many as 2 million died in this Middle Passage portion of triangular trade. And again, it's difficult to catalog the exact number. Certainly there are estimates that are much higher than 2 million, but nonetheless, 2 million is a significant number. About 11 million Africans were enslaved during the time period of the slave trade, so the 1500s through the middle of the 1800s. 11 million is a truly significant number, and we've talked in the past, remember, the majority of slaves that were brought to the New World were sent to the sugar plantations in South America and in Central America. A much smaller percentage, but certainly not insignificant, were sold and put to work on the plantations, in the households in the North Americas. It's important to mention that the slave trade ramped up during this time. So in the beginning, there were about 2,000 slaves that came over each year in the 1500s. By the time we get to the peak of the slave trade in the 1780s, we're talking about 80,000 Africans per year that are brought over to the Americas. And again, all in all, about 11 million were sold into slavery and brought over, and at least 2 million died during the Middle Passage. That number is quite likely to be higher than that, but again, documentation isn't always available. So our key terms in this section: Olaudah Equiano, the African slave in the late 1700s, published his autobiography detailing his firsthand experiences. And again, next year we will take a closer look at his writings as a primary document and get a better understanding of his first-person account. Triangular trade, the colonial trade routes between Europe and the colonies, including Africa, and the contact and the commerce that happened between those 3 points. The Middle Passage, the second leg of triangular trade, where slaves were sold, put onto cargo ships, and transported to the Americas, generally to work on the plantations. Mutiny, probably a term you've heard before. A revolt aboard a ship, most likely in this case, where slaves revolt against the conditions that they're having to deal with in the Middle Passage. And that's the end of our discussion of Section 4. Thank you so much for listening.